Today's video is sponsored by Keeps. Believe it or not, hair loss is a problem that affects over 60% of men. And while there is no magic cure for baldness, you can prevent hair loss from happening in the first place. Keeps is a subscription service where you can tailor an FDA-approved solution to your specific stage of hair loss. Unfortunately, it is a bit late for me. Keeps can only stop hair loss, not regenerate hair, so it's best to take action in the early stages of hair loss. Most people see results in around 6 months. Once your treatment plan is established, your products are sent to you every 3 months with the correct amounts for daily use at half the cost of the pharmacy. They also have online medical support because hair loss is a medical issue, and you need to be sure that the hair loss is not a symptom of something more serious. But don't just take our word for it. Head to their website and check the reviews for before and after photos of real men who've had success with this program. So, if this is a problem that is bothering you or someone you care about, and you have a US address, remember, hair loss stops with Keeps. Take action now and get 50% off your first order at keeps.com/VisualPolitik or click on the link in the description. That's keeps.com/VisualPolitik. Since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, Russian troops have suffered major setbacks. For example, they have had to abandon the siege of Kyiv after several weeks trying to take the Ukrainian capital. So at this point, I think there are some questions that ring out loud and clear. Why is the Russian army performing so poorly? How is it possible that they've not been able to take any cities? In today's video, we are not going to talk about the atrocities committed by the Russian army. We are going to focus on military strategy and purely technical issues. Think of it this way. This is the Ukrainian army, and this is the Russian army. In other words, there should be no point of comparison here. Russia has a far superior military than Ukraine. What's more, if anything characterizes Putin's Russia, it's the militaristic culture. We've already talked about it here on VisualPolitik. The Kremlin has even built a cathedral dedicated to its armed forces. We all kind of expected that in a matter of days, Russian soldiers would capture Kyiv and the main Ukrainian cities. However, after more than a month, Russia has not been able to take a single major city. According to some sources, during the first month of the invasion alone, Russia suffered more than 20,000 casualties. To give you an idea, these figures exceed the casualties suffered by the US Army during the entire 20 years of the war in Afghanistan. Of course, the Ukrainians are also suffering heavy casualties, but that is kind of to be expected. Supposedly, those who had all the aces up their sleeves were the Russians. In other words, the Russian military already had several failures in its history, but we all expected that Putin's reforms were working. And what failures are we talking about? From Georgia to Chechnya, all the wars the Russian Federation have fought have been bitter victories. Yes, Russia won the Chechen wars, but at the cost of losing thousands of soldiers. And I know what many of you are thinking, this is anti-Russian propaganda, but that's not the case. Vladimir Putin himself was aware that his army was not ready for a modern war. And that's why in 2008, the Kremlin put all of its resources into bringing its army into the 21st century. For this, Putin counted on 2 key figures, Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and Valery Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces. I want to tell you to keep this name fresh in your mind. Valery Gerasimov. If you are a long-time follower of us here on VisualPolitik, and if you're not, subscribe down here, this name will be familiar to you. He is a military rock star, respected throughout the military community, even by his NATO adversaries. Many would say he is the intellectual father of the next generation warfare concept. In fact, we all thought that, with Gerasimov at the helm, the Russian armed forces would abandon the Soviet heritage and enter the 21st century. However, we are seeing that in Russia, the old adage that was so often repeated in Soviet times still persists.
People pretend to work and the government pretends to pay. Old Soviet proverb.
Say what you like about the Soviets, they had some good sayings. In today's video, we're going to avoid focusing on the war in Ukraine, nor are we going to talk about Russian weapons. We'll leave all of that for 2 more videos we'll be doing in the future. But the question we're asking today is, why is the Russian military such a mess? What exactly is wrong with the Russian armed forces? How is it possible for such an authoritarian country with such a militaristic culture to have such a disorganized military? Today, we're going to answer all these questions, but first, let's look at some history.
Lack of training.
We've all seen pictures of Russian soldiers captured by Ukrainians. Ukrainian propaganda has taken upon itself to spread these images with great fanfare for all of us to see how they phone their mothers. However, there is something very interesting about all these images. Almost all of the soldiers are very young. In most of them, the soldiers are not even 20 years old. And this indicates one thing. They are soldiers with very little training. This goes some way to explaining why Russian troops are dropping like flies in the face of Ukrainian fire. And it also helps explain news stories like this one.
Kharkiv blast. 2 Russian soldiers came to the Ukrainian police to ask for diesel fuel.
In fairness, I've definitely done dumber things when I was 20. Of course, this news is pure Ukrainian propaganda, but it is one more example of the many we have seen. Let's put it plainly. Russia has a very serious problem when it comes to training its soldiers. Most of its troops are conscripts doing compulsory military service. To give you an idea, it is estimated that a quarter of Russia's elite troops, the so-called Spetsnaz, are conscripts. And why is that, you may ask? To understand this, we have to go back to the times of the Soviet Union. In those years, compulsory military service was 2 years. Virtually all Soviet men had to serve in the army when they came of age. This had an advantage. The Soviet Union had a lot of soldiers. But there is a problem. 2 years is not enough time to train for modern warfare. After World War II, the great powers, mainly the United States and the Soviet Union, entered into an arms race. The more complex the weapons, the more training time they require. This explains why fewer and fewer countries have compulsory military service. For several decades now, almost all armies have made a huge effort, and Russia is no exception. In 2008, the Kremlin reduced compulsory military service. In addition, the army launched a huge recruitment campaign. They wanted to hire soldiers who were willing to forge a career in the military. Professional soldiers who could serve in the army for several years to gain the necessary experience in modern warfare. To recruit soldiers, you need 2 things: money and people who want to enlist. 2 things that are in short supply in Russia. To give you an idea, today the Russian army has about 850,000 troops. Of these, only 405,000 are professional soldiers, and these professional soldiers do not last many years in the army. For example, a NATO sergeant can serve an average of 15 to 20 years. In Russia, it is rare to find soldiers who have served more than 4. To illustrate this another way, a fighter pilot in NATO has to fly for more than 200 hours in order to be combat ready. In Russia, 100 hours is enough. And I know what many of you might be thinking. Why don't they have a similar problem in, say, Israel? We all know that Israel has compulsory military service. Both Israeli men and women have to serve in the army for 2 years. However, no one would say that Israeli troops are poorly trained. So what does Israel have that Russia doesn't have? Well, we're going to look at that now.
An army without sergeants.
In general terms, we could say that there are 2 ways to enter an army: as a soldier or as an officer. Officers are trained in academies. In this respect, Russia can give any other army a run for its money. Russian admirals, colonels, and generals are trained on par with those of any other country. Again, no one doubts the professionalism of such a figure as General Valery Gerasimov. The problem is that an army needs more than recruits and officers. In between, there is a key figure, the non-commissioned officer, the NCO. In other words, the sergeants. Sergeants are soldiers with years of experience who can train new recruits. They are a key area in any army. And this is where Russia has a very serious problem. Think about it this way. It is estimated that only 1% of recruits re-enlist in the army after doing military service. This means that there are very few sergeants who can train new soldiers. So why doesn't anyone want to re-enlist in the Russian army? Aren't they supposed to have a militaristic culture that glorifies the exports of their armed forces? Remember that Putin has even gone so far as to create youth militias. This means, in theory, Russian soldiers have more patriotic fervor than any other country. And yes, it is true, the dream of many young men is to enlist and serve the motherland. But once they get in the army, they are faced with a nightmare. Remember this word, dedovshchina. Check it out.
Russian soldier shoots dead 8 colleagues at Siberian military base.
This soldier in question shot his fellow soldiers after suffering months of hazing and abuse. Dedovshchina is the Russian word for hazing. To give you an idea, in 2006, suicide was the cause of death for 40% of peacetime soldiers. In 2014, 15 recruits died from hazing. As you can imagine, with such a toxic culture, it makes sense that most Russian soldiers do not last more than 4 years in the army. In fact, in 2009, Russia opened its first NCO academy to try and fill this shortage of sergeants. But this is not enough. Every year, 2,000 new NCOs graduate, and Russia needs many more than that. In the absence of well-trained sergeants, they end up with battalions led by conscripts with 1 year of experience. So as often happened in the Soviet Union, young generals pretended to lead their battalions and conscripts pretended to obey. And you may ask, is it really Vladimir Putin's fault that the Russian army is performing so poorly? Why is this much talked about army reform and the Kremlin consisted of? Where is General Valery Gerasimov's influence? Well, check this out.
All the president's men.
The question you are all wondering now is, how could Putin have made such a miscalculation? Everything indicates that Russia expected a blitzkrieg. They even thought that the Ukrainian army would not resist and that civilians would welcome the Russian liberators with open arms. Evidently, this was not the case. The question is, was there no intelligence service advising Vladimir Putin? Remember that we are not talking about a small miscalculation, but about a fully fledged invasion in which Russia has accumulated more than 20,000 casualties. Strange as it may seem, everything suggests that there is in fact not. In fact, the supposed disappearance of Valery Gerasimov is striking. He is the rock star of the Russian army, something like the Russian version of General Petraeus in the United States. So is it really realistic to think that Putin is micromanaging the war in Ukraine? I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that a politician has micromanaged a war. We saw it during the Vietnam War. In that case, then US President Lyndon B. Johnson went so far as to manage the minutest of details from the Oval Office. The result was an absolute embarrassment for the US military.
When it comes to the war in Ukraine, the Russian army hasn't appointed a central commander till April, right after their defeat in Kyiv. The new commander-in-chief of the war in Ukraine is General Alexander Dvorkinov. He used to manage the Russian intervention in Syria, and he was the head of the army in the southern region. Still, it is unclear how much decision-making power will he have, and how much Putin will interfere with his work.
Also, think about it this way. Over the years, Russia has evolved into a personalistic dictatorship, and that affects the military as well. Think of it this way. During the Soviet era, Russia was an unmitigated dictatorship. However, the main decision-making body was the Politburo, a central committee of the Communist Party. It could have up to 35 members who discussed all decisions. Today, the Soviet Politburo no longer exists, and now we have this. It may look like a caricature, but everything points to the same thing. A personalist dictatorship. A political system where one man has the power to make all decisions without a counterweight. And yes, this is noticeable in the military. For example, in almost all countries, the armed forces are headed by the High General Staff, which in turn reports to the Ministry of Defense. However, Russia has a special army as well. A kind of Praetorian Guard for Putin. We're talking about the National Guard, known by the name Rosguardia. This body was created by Putin himself in 2016. It has more than 340,000 troops and is led directly by Vladimir Putin. In other words, more than a third of all of those 850,000 Russian soldiers are outside the regular army. That is, they do not report to General Gerasimov. They take direct orders from the president. It may surprise you, but this is a constant in almost all authoritarian regimes. Many of you would think that the military functions better in a militaristic dictatorship than in a democracy. However, authoritarian leaders rarely fully trust their military. That explains why Putin has created his own Praetorian Guard. In principle, this National Guard is not a body designed to fight in war. You could say that they are kind of militarized police. Their objective is to safeguard the territorial control of Russia itself. That is, to fight against insurgent groups, terrorist groups, and to suppress protests. And remember that officially, Russia is not at war, right? According to the Kremlin, the invasion of Ukraine is a special military operation to denazify a territory full of anti-Russian insurgents. Conclusion? Putin is most likely trying to send in the National Guard. And that explains news headlines like this one.
2 members of Rosguardia were sacked for refusing to join the invasion.
Think about it. The National Guard is not trained for war as such. Sending them to the front is a death sentence for many of them. But remember that we are talking about an entire political system centered around the figure of Vladimir Putin. Who would dare to argue with him at this point? Think of it this way. Practically all the key figures in the military and the military industry are handpicked by the president. His party, United Russia, holds almost all the seats in parliament. Out of 450 seats in the Russian Duma, 325 belong to Putin's party. In other words, there are no checks and balances on the Kremlin's power. What this means is that no one can question Putin's own miscalculations, including the invasion of Ukraine. At this point, no one can deny that Putin has miscalculated his forces. He expected that his troops would conquer Kyiv in a few days, and the Ukrainians would welcome Russians with open arms. In a democracy, the intelligence services would have been free to inform the president. They could contradict him and explain to him the reality on the ground. The generals themselves could prepare a realistic strategy based on a more thorough knowledge of their military muscle. But in this case, what we are seeing is a former KGB officer with no military training making decisions without anyone standing up to him. And that explains failures like this one.
Russian troops pull back from areas near Kyiv, Ukrainian officials say.
Once again, Putin is pretending that the invasion of Ukraine is not a war, and he expects his National Guard and army to pretend to fight a special operation. The question now is, to what extent will the old Soviet proverb still work? Will we really see the Russian army reorganize and try to attack Kyiv again? To what extent could Russia win this war without having to use its nuclear or chemical weapons? You can leave me your answer in the comments below. And as always, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, so we know. And I'll see you next time.